In today's Parsha, we encounter this fascinating story of Jacob that picks up after he had left home and was fleeing from the area of the Negev desert up to and beyond the Euphrates River in Mesopotamia. Now, there's a number of facets and events that happen during his stay up there and upon his leaving. However, if we back away and look at the overall story of Jacob from the panoramic view, it always seems to revolve around family conflict, with him at the center of it. You know, it's the rare family in human societies that doesn't deal with family conflicts of one type or another. What we read in the Bible can look very much like something we can expect to happen today in our own families, with but a change in names and the exact circumstances, of course. Therefore, while there may be an exception among us, there are some lessons that we can all learn and hopefully heed about family conflict. Some on how to avoid it, others on how to deal with it once it erupts. This part of the book of Genesis is actually that part of the story of Jacob that has him running away from the murderous intentions of his brother, Esau. Now, we should note that this is the second story in the Bible of brothers and family conflict that escalates to such hatred that murder is the intention of one of them who feels he's been seriously wronged by the other. The first case was with Cain, who carried out his rage. He killed his brother, Abel, out of jealousy for losing a competition over who brought the better sacrifice to God. In Jacob and Esau's case, the two brothers actually began their competition in the womb of their mother, Rebekah. In Genesis 25, verses 22 and 23, the children fought with each other inside of her so much that she said, if it's going to be like this, why go on living? So she went to inquire of Yehovah, who answered her, there are two nations in your womb. From birth, they will be two rival peoples. One of these peoples will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Now, this conflict between these two brothers has never been resolved. And it has played out throughout history. It's not just a matter of jealousy or differences of opinion. It has led to murder and war sporadically for over more than 3,500 years. And it is far from over. The latest wishful thinking of most of the world is that of the Palestinians achieving statehood and ending in the so-called two-state solution that will bring this ancient conflict to a close. That's a mirage. The enmity between Esau and Jacob will not end until Yeshua returns and sets up his Father's kingdom. Yet, we are to pray often about this intractable situation and for peace in Jerusalem, because in the Lord's economy, all things are possible. Even times of peace that go on for a few months or a few short years are welcomed respite. However, when we believe in the prophets of Israel, as we read in the Bible, then the thing that most of us don't want to see happen, an internationally recognized Palestinian state, is going to happen anyway. It at first may seem like an amazing breakthrough, but in time, it will be little more than a staging ground used for the destruction of Israel. According to the prophets, the state of the world, and especially as it concerns Israel and the nations that surround here, from here forward is going to be one of chaos and wars broken only by brief moments of peace. Esau had murderous intents against his brother Jacob. This is the very reason that Jacob had to run away from his brother and leave the land of promise for what is now northern Syria. Esau had some good characteristics, and this becomes evident in next week's reading of the Torah. Esau is sentimental. There's even a side to him that wants to end their familial discord. So when he meets his brother Jacob and sees that the Lord has blessed him and that he is not hostile towards him, Esau hugs his brother and kisses him, and in a magnanimous moment seems to forgive his brother Jacob, but it was only something on the surface. It didn't do anything to alter Esau's true heart. Therefore, their reconciliation was short-lived. The offspring of Esau have carried their father's deep hurts and grievances for countless generations, right on up until today. So perhaps there are some things we can take from this ongoing saga to benefit our own lives and to heal, maybe to prevent family conflicts from happening in the first place. See, one of the things we ought not to do is to take advantage of a family member's weaknesses. This really ought to extend all the way to how we deal with our fellow man in general. Getting the best of someone in a business deal, for example, isn't always the wisest course for the long term. Fair, equitable, honest, that's the best course. Or being a person who receives the greatest inheritance from their parents and not doing something to consider the others who got little or nothing sets up one for a lifetime of bad blood. I have witnessed how business dealings within families can turn out disastrously. Often it is less about what's legal. It's more about a perception of fairness or a lack of compassion for a brother or sister. Another lesson is that it is always better to make peace, if at all possible. But almost always, the one who holds the upper hand must be the one to give some concessions. Peace usually comes with a price. And even though it's worth it, in the end, you cannot make peace unilaterally. Both sides must want it. Jacob's mother knew that no deal, no peace was possible because Esau wanted revenge, not peace. Apology can be a great healer, especially to someone you love. The best of people with the best of intent can do something wrong to hurt another. Confessing this to the person you have aggrieved can set the stage for the end of hostility. And by the way, this can even apply for something you've done wrong to an enemy. Yet wisdom is called for. Do not assume that you confessing a wrongdoing or being the one to reach out with that olive branch will receive an honest response. Even though it may be the right thing to do, do not be naive. Long-term hurts cannot always be satisfied so easily. So a measure of caution in Further dealings with a family member or even enemy is called for. Be contrite and sincere, but be wary, because your intent may not mirror the feelings or character of the other person. See, clearly our story about this part of Jacob's life reveals all these lessons as he hoped for the best but planned for the worst. He didn't expect Esau to be a completely changed person, nor to just forgive and forget. But Jacob did hope that time, sincere apology, substantial gifts of appeasement would dull the anger. Both Jacob and his mother understood that the deed of deception that Jacob had committed to receive that firstborn blessing that by tradition belonged to his brother did not come with clean hands. See, some rabbis and pastors will attempt all sorts of gyrations to say that what Jacob and his mother did was right. The outcome was what God wanted. But the process to get there was not. And process matters. So when Jacob returns to the land of Canaan, he was ready to pay Esau, his brother, a great deal of money, sheep, goats, gold and silver, camels, donkeys, in order to pacify him. Let's back up now to when Jacob had been in Mesopotamia for many years, had married Rachel and Leah, each bearing him children, and suddenly circumstances change. Family conflict arises yet again. In Genesis chapter 31, we witness history repeat itself. Jacob had a life in many ways similar to Abraham. He was a man without a country, a wanderer. Did he belong to Mesopotamia? Did he belong to the land of Canaan? We are reminded of the situation between Lot and Abraham when Lot's wealth grew such that it caused tension between those loyal to Abraham and those loyal to Lot. So the only solution was separation. Jacob and his father-in-law Laban now find themselves in a similar situation. See, it's rare in the Bible that we find division and separation occurring on happy terms. Something unpleasant was usually at the heart of the matter to cause it, just as we find here with Jacob. So perhaps we should take heart that the divisions and separations that have happened in our own lives, resulting from bad judgment, selfishness, sin, or even something completely out of our control, are normal. It is a Christian cliche that God uses imperfect people to bring about his perfect will. In reality, what other kind of people are there than imperfect for him to work with? Just as Lot cut ties permanently with Abraham and went on to form a new and separate family line that would result in the nations of Moab and Ammon, here we find that Jacob will, due to circumstances that Jehovah uses to achieve his divine purposes, finally cut family ties with the land of Mesopotamia and with his in-laws, who, as you will recall, were also already family members by blood. Now, although Jacob will eventually lead his own family, with him at the head, to Egypt for the purpose of survival, it's now clear that the land of Canaan is his home and his destiny. There is no other. Now, in light of where we stand in the 21st century along the spectrum of redemption history, which I fully believe we are in the final stages of it, but I want to highlight that moment that Jacob realized there was only one place on earth for him and his offspring. The land of Canaan that would someday become the land of Israel. That reality remains today, and it will, right through the climax of the end times. The Israelites of modern times, that we tend to call Israelis, have only one place on earth that is rightfully theirs to live. God gave that place to them. No other place, and to no one else. There was a time only barely 100 years ago when the world tried to set aside someplace else for them, with what is now Uganda is that preferred place. By only a small margin, the World Zionist Congress rejected it. Okay. This is why Israel steadfastly refuses to give in to the Muslim world, or to the EU, or to the USA, or to any other world power to give their enemies some of their land in exchange for a promise of peace. They foolishly tried this once before, gave Gaza to the Palestinians. I don't have to go into detail to remind you what has happened, because it's ongoing. God is allowing Israel to pay a horrible price for their disobedience, to think they can give away what belongs to him. In verse 1 of chapter 31, Jacob gets word that Laban's sons are grumbling about how Jacob's herds and flocks really ought to be theirs. Boy, the apple didn't fall far from the tree, does it? Laban's sons are just like their father. Jealous, selfish, dishonest, greedy. And when the ever-observant Jacob notices the distinct change in demeanor of Laban's family, he knows it's time to leave. Now, that notion is verified by God, who instructs Jacob that now is the time that he will fulfill his promise to bring Jacob back to his true home, which is Canaan. Jacob consults with his wives, and happily, they are more than ready to leave. In fact, they reveal their hurt and anger towards their father, Laban, for in their eyes, he had shown them the greatest disrespect and shamed them by virtually selling them to Jacob, instead of following the usual Mesopotamian betrothal customs. I'd also like to point out something else here. The Bible never attempts to obscure that Hebrew society was male-dominated. However, Hebrew society greatly revered women, protected and provided for them, and any notion that the Bible promotes the idea that women were then or are now of less value than men is just uninformed. Notice here that the Holy Scriptures show that the first thing Jacob did after God told him it was time to leave was to consult with his wives. And it's obvious by the way they responded that Jacob greatly considered their feelings and their thoughts on the matter. It's not that Jacob didn't lead, it's that he included his wives in the decision that greatly affected them, leaving their family forever. Wisely, Jacob avoided yet another kind of family conflict merely by taking his wives into consideration, being open and honest with them rather than commanding them, which is something that he actually had every right to do as head of the family. Jacob plans their escape and executes it. He puts his family on camels, separates his property from Laban's, and in an opportune moment, while Laban is off shearing some sheep, they leave. But not before Rachel steals her father's set of household gods to take with her on the journey. Why would she do that? The verse just before this answers that question. In verse 14, the two sisters said to Jacob, "Do we still have any portion of inheritance in our father's house?" See, this was not a rhetorical question. Okay. In other words, they knew full well that their father had no intention of caring for them, and they were concerned about it. Even more, this is an indication that they are breaking allegiance with their father. For in verse 16, they say, "All that Jacob's God took from Laban now belongs to us and our children." Here we see another case of division, election, and separation, and it was not a particularly happy one. Now, in Mesopotamia, it was the tradition that he who possessed the family gods indicated ownership of the family wealth and authority. So by Rachel stealing these gods, it was her intent to assure a family inheritance for herself after her father died. Apparently, she planned on keeping them until Laban went to the grave, then appearing before her family with what amounted to the will, the keys to the safety deposit box, and the right to be executor of the estate all rolled into one. This was a most serious matter that went way above petty theft. And Rachel was fully in the wrong. And this latest family conflict became very serious, even possibly deadly, very fast. But even more, Laban and his family, and likely Rachel as well, believed these idols were real and held real power. Those who adhered to this particular God's system prayed to these idols for rain, for healing, for children, for protection, so on. Without his gods, Laban was in a fix in more ways than one. Now, Jacob and his family make their break for freedom, but Laban soon finds out that they're gone, and he mounts a posse to go after him. And during a search for them, God comes to Laban in a dream. He warns him not to speak either good or bad to Jacob. This simply means that Laban is not to try to harm Jacob. But it points out something kind of interesting. God will at times speak to those who don't worship him. This isn't the first time we've seen Yahweh speaking to pagans. It won't be the last. Laban was a spiritualist. He accepted many gods. So it was no big deal for him to accept that Jacob's God was quite real. Let us never think that Yahweh only interacts with or speaks to believers. He will communicate with and use whomever he wishes. After all, the scriptures even tell of a time that he spoke through a donkey. And at the same time, let us also not think that because God has spoken to someone, then that is an indication that that person is a believer or perhaps favored in God's eyes. Laban loved to invoke Yahweh's name when speaking to Jacob, but not because he revered God Almighty or bowed down to him. He did it in hopes of influencing Jacob or Yahweh for his own selfish reasons. Laban and his men catch up to Jacob in an area called Gilead that someday will belong to Gad, one of Jacob's sons. This is actually located on the east side of the Jordan River, not in Canaan. And Laban, full of hypocrisy, never at a loss for a good lie, scolds Jacob for leaving in secret, thus not permitting Laban to throw him a farewell party and give his daughters and grandchildren the proper goodbye. Hardly. He would have done anything to prevent them from leaving. And of course, immediately upon his insincere but customary words of greeting, Laban inquires about his missing gods, which is the real crux of the matter. Jacob says to Laban, if you can find them, not only you're welcome to them, but the person who took them will be executed. Uh-oh. Rachel is now in grave danger, and she knows it. I mean, does this not remind us of the dangers of making a rash vow, which God fully expects the vow maker to keep? Jacob had no idea Rachel had taken those gods. Clever Rachel hides them from her father by sitting on them. She tells her father that she isn't standing up because she's on her monthly cycle, and her father doesn't demand she stand up, so he can search not because he feels sensitive towards her, but because of her current condition. Rather, it's because, you see, he would become ritually impure by coming into contact with her or whatever she's sitting on. The concept of a woman being unclean and transmitting that ritual uncleanness while on her cycle is something that Moses will be instructed on 500 years into the future. But it was also a law and a tradition that had already been in existence among almost all cultures, long before Moses, even before Jacob. Jacob, having no idea that Rachel actually has those idols, now is really angry at Laban's accusation. I mean, Jacob's had it. And he lays into Laban, saying that 20 years of servitude ought to be quite enough, thank you, for 2 wives and some speckled sheep and goats. And he tells Laban that he was well aware that Laban had been cheating him, constantly changing the terms of the deal. Now take note, this was not some virile and mature man standing up to Laban. Jacob is now in his 90s. Laban's answer is typical Laban. Everything you have is mine. He had never been able to accept the idea that Jacob's wealth had come about primarily from the high birth rate of discolored animals that Laban didn't want in the first place. However, in a rather ingenious display of graciousness, Laban says, let's bury the hatchet, since he certainly doesn't want to be an enemy of his own daughters. Laban and Jacob make a treaty with one another not to war. Together they put up a pile of stones as a testament to their agreement, and they have the typical covenant meal to seal the agreement. The primary terms of the treaty are that Jacob is to treat Laban's daughters well, and that he is to take no other wives. Jacob adhered to this agreement. Probably wasn't much of a sacrifice for Jacob since he was 90-ish after all. And from here, Jacob will move on to what he fears most, an encounter with his twin brother Esau, whom he had cheated out of his family inheritance. Unfortunately, family conflict plays an enormous role in nearly every major stage of Israel's development. And it plays a heavy role in every God worshiper's life. I think it is only appropriate that I quote one of Yeshua's most challenging and troubling instructions to his potential followers, because it is directly about inevitable family conflict. Something that is not to be considered as strange or abnormal, but rather we must all be prepared for it because it's likely. He says this in Luke 14:26. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father, his mother, his wife, his children, his brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life besides, he cannot be my disciple.
For more teachings and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship here at The Seed. Enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.